We now move to First Minister's question time. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Indeed, to ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of this International Women's Day.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, with your permission, I'd like to say just a few words about Paul McBride, who died tragically last weekend. Paul was an outstanding advocate, a very substantial public figure in Scotland. His reservoir of talent was great indeed. I believe he had a great deal more to contribute to the law and indeed to the great debate on Scotland's future. He will be sorely missed, and I am sure the whole Chamber will wish to convey our condolences as a Parliament to Paul's partner Gary, his parents and his many friends and colleagues. Presiding Officer, today, as was said, is International Women's Day, a day when the world celebrates the achievements and contributions of women past and present. Here in Scotland, I want to acknowledge the tremendous contribution made by women to Scottish society. So this is a fitting opportunity to announce that the Scottish Government have committed to fund the Scottish Resource Centre for Women in Science, Engineering and Technology at Napier University. Funding for the UK parent body had been removed by Westminster. The facility faced closure. We have acted now to ensure that this centre, which supports the success of women in fields of endeavour where they are significantly underrepresented, it remains open to continue its vital work.
Joanne Lamont.
And may I, on behalf of the Labour benches, add our support and sympathy on the very sad and tragic loss of Paul McBride, both to his family and, of course, to the important and critical debates within Scotland itself. And, as the First Minister says, he will be sadly lost. Presiding Officer, John McAlpine, the First Minister's parliamentary aide, this week likened Scotland's place within the United Kingdom to that of a woman in an abusive marriage. Does the First Minister agree?
First Minister.
Well, no, she didn't. The Labour Party, feeling the need to misrepresent, really shouldn't treat hugely important issues in this fashion. Yeah. John McAlpine talked about the abuse of power. It's what she talked about in her column. I think there are abuses of power in terms of Westminster Government over Scotland, and I think if the Labour Party should try to treat the hugely important issue of abuse against women with the importance it deserves and not feel the desperate need to misrepresent what other people say.
Joanne Lamont.
I think the First Minister be very careful about suggesting that people on this side wish to diminish the issue of domestic abuse and violence in the home. The reality is, across this Parliament, there has been a commitment and cooperation to address these questions, which is precisely why I think the First Minister should reflect on what his aide said. And it is for the First Minister to handle his aide is entirely a matter for him. But I don't know many people who have come out of an abusive marriage, entered into a social union and kept the same bank account as the First Minister suggests for a separate Scotland. The reality is, and he needs to deal with this, his aide's analogies are as offensive to women as his policies are damaging. Policies which put 400 women out of work every day. It's not been part of the United Kingdom, as his aide alleges, which is holding women back. We have Tory cuts compounded by the First Minister's inaction. That is why female unemployment is higher in Scotland than the rest of the United Kingdom. When is he going to start doing something to help women back to work? Or, like everything else, do we have to wait his 1,000 days for a referendum before he lifts a finger?
What I was pointing out to Joanne Lamont was that a hugely important issue shouldn't be demeaned by taking somebody's remarks totally out of context and totally distorted. There are plenty of abuses of power of Westminster over Scotland. I would regard the Remploy employees today, for example, suffering from an abuse of Westminster power. I would regard the cuts to the disability living allowance in Scotland as a huge abuse of power. And I would regard the plans to replace the Trident missiles in the Clyde as an enormous abuse of power which should be sorted out in Scotland. Now, in terms of the seriousness of the issue as we have challenged and taken it as a Parliament, I am sure Joanne Lamont will be the first to acknowledge that against the extraordinary difficult circumstances of Westminster cuts that were told by Alistair Darling to be deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher, The fact that the investment in key areas in Scotland has not been just maintained but increased against this background is a huge tribute to the commitment that we as a government and we as a parliament. For example, funding for violence against women, including domestic abuse, has doubled. Funding has increased from £21 million over 3 years to £55 million in the 4 years 2008 to 2012. Now, against that background of cuts imposed from Westminster, surely these figures indicate this government's endeavour, our joint endeavour, to give these hugely important issues the priority they deserve.
Lamont.
I already acknowledge there's a commitment across the Parliament on domestic abuse, and I recognise the funding for that. I hear from the First Minister a critique of what the Tories in Westminster have done, who, by the way, are a problem because they're Tories, not because they're English. I hear nothing about his responsibilities. The point I was making was that women's female unemployment is higher in Scotland than it is in the rest of the United Kingdom. That is his responsibility. The Deputy First Minister, of course, has also been making grand promises this week. Apparently, it's only in an independent Scotland that we can have policies that don't offend our sense of decency. Yet, on her government's watch, fuel poverty is double what it is in England. She does nothing. Childcare costs are higher in the United Kingdom, and she does nothing. 1 in 4 children live in poverty, and she does nothing. Isn't this the Manana government? Doing nothing for people in difficulty today, promising them the world tomorrow, a tomorrow that is at least 1,000 days away.
First Minister.
Can I point out that the reason a Tory government rules over key areas of Scottish life is precisely because the Labour Party have accepted the position of Westminster control over vital areas of Scotland. Now, there is a huge difficulty in unemployment at the present moment across the sectors of society affecting women, affecting young people, of course. But I think Joanne Lamont should at least recognise that the employment rate, the number of people in jobs, and there are 10,000 more women employed in Scotland than there were just over a year ago, 10,000 more, but the number of women in jobs is the highest across these islands. The employment rate in Scotland for women is higher than England, higher than Wales, higher than Northern Ireland. That is something that should be acknowledged. And in terms of issues as we move forward, I think I've already said to Joanne Lamont the importance that I stress and give to the figures we're seeing from modern apprenticeships. Remember the modern apprenticeships that the Labour Party voted against in the budget debate. That has moved from 27% of young women participating in modern apprenticeships when they were at a disgracefully low level of 15,000 or 16,000 to 45% participating in modern apprenticeships now at the much increased level of 25,000. So I hope that as a Parliament we can unite to look at that 25,000 modern apprenticeships, not just for this year but stretching through the next 5 years, and see that percentage of young women going in to learn trades and skills ever increasing as a contribution to our acknowledgement as a Parliament of the critical role of women in working and Scottish society.
Joanne Lamont.
You see, if the First Minister was talking to women, he would know his figures on employment for women is masking something much more serious. We have lost over 100,000 full-time jobs to temporary and part-time jobs. Women in local government, which you have targeted for cuts, and in the voluntary sector, are having their hours cut. The figures are masking the fact that women disproportionately are suffering unemployment and underemployment. But the gap between the words and the reality grows as we speak. Last week, the First Minister told us that the only thing Rupert Murdoch got when he visited him was a cup of tea and a caramel wafer. Now we found out he also offered Murdoch a multi-million-pound tax cut. And of course, there's a pattern here. If you're a working person,
we will hear the member, please.
If you're a working person who needs help now, all you get from the First Minister are warm words about what might happen in 1,000 days. But if you're Fred Goodwin, you get all the backing the First Minister can muster. If you're Donald Trump, you get direct access to the Chief Planning Officer. And if you're Rupert Murdoch, you get offers of £1 million tax cuts in exchange for headlines. Some might say, First Minister, Scotland bought and sold for Murdoch gold. Isn't it about time? Isn't it about time? Isn't it about time that we heard, and women heard, and families across this country heard less about his fantasies for tomorrow and more about how he will deal with the realities of today?
First Minister.
I think that law would indicate that Joanne Lamont would be better to focus on one subject at a time in these question times. Let's look at the issues, the substantive issues. Well,
order. We'll hear the First Minister. Order.
Better asking questions badly in one subject than asking them badly in 6 subjects, in my opinion. So let me give Joanne Lamont the statistics. Accepting, of course, unemployment is far too high. There's 10,000 more women in work than there was just over a year ago. The figure for employment, people actually in jobs, which really is a very important figure, is 66.8% in Scotland, is 65.3% in England. The number of young women not just starting modern apprenticeships at 45%, but can also tell her in training for work statistics has gone up from 28% 3 years ago to 35% now. There is still more work to do, but again it indicates that young women taking their rightful place in the workforce. In terms of positive destinations, that's young women leaving school, going on to the positive destinations of full-time education, employment and training. It's now 90.4%, an increase from 87.8% in 2006-2007. The commitment of this government to no compulsory redundancies in our controlled public sector and the health service is vital for all workers, but it seems to me particularly vital for women, given the importance they play in the public sector workforce. And finally, of course, the delivery, not the commitment, not the promise, but the delivery by this government of something the Labour government never did, and that's the living wage at £7.23 an hour across our controlled public sector. That is why, when it came to the test last year, not just a vast majority of Scottish men, but a substantial majority of Scottish women gave this government their endorsement and placed their hopes in this government for improving the lot of women and Scottish society by getting control over the towering heights of this economy so as we can mould a better future free of Tory government.
Question number 2.